I am Heidi Waterhouse. I'm a technical writer, and I am really frustrated by all of the dev people I work with because y'all keep making the same mistakes, and it's getting on my nerves, and the only thing I could think of to fix it was to go on the conference tour circuit and talk to a bunch of you at once, because my like 1 to 10 at a time approach was not working for me. So this is the introduction slide. I want to bring your attention down there in that corner is the hashtag for this particular panel. I really encourage all speakers to do this because it makes it so much easier to storify the tweets that you get because you can find them. And this is my Twitter handle, and that's on all the slides because I love it when people put their Twitter handles on the beginning and then they say something interesting 14 slides in, and I'm like, it's gone. It's not here anymore. So, what is a technical writer? A technical writer is someone who takes a bunch of terrible information and assembles it into a coherent narrative, right? So, what I'm doing is I'm gathering information up, I'm applying a bunch of synthesis, and I'm giving you some kind of story that you can believe and understand. So, that's part of what makes me uniquely qualified to tell you what you're doing wrong. Also, my products are, as a writer, are synthesis and anti-words. Anti-words are all of the words I take out of your documentation because you didn't need them there in the first place and you were just worried you weren't saying enough. So I take out a lot of words. And I have worked at conservative count for at least 15 companies in my career. I'm what they call high churn. And I find life as a consultant is working out much better for me. But when I say these are universally applicable, I mean they're applicable from Microsoft to 4 people in a basement. This truck is stuck in the mud. I think we all get stuck in the mud because after a while, we develop preferences about what stage of software we like to be in. There's some people who really like the juggernaut of mature software and they really like feeling like they're doing enterprise grade work. And there's some people who really only enjoy doing startup work and they really want to be there. And the problem with having a preference like that, a rut like that, is that we move on every time we just start to see the consequences of our actions. So like, you stay at a startup for a while, it grows into a not so startup, you leave because there's like HR and they're annoying and you have to fill out forms, but you never see what happens to your software after that because it just grows up and becomes a different thing. So how many of you have gotten the lecture on retirement and compound interest, right? Start saving now, it'll add up later. How many of you have looked at your student loan bills and been unclear on how they have not gone down after years of payment, right? Compound interest. I'm here to tell you that technical debt is a pernicious form of compound interest. It's like the leg breaker of compound interest. It's worse than Sally Mae. Because early mistakes that you make in your product design and construction will become super painful later on. They'll be super expensive to fix. And they weren't that bad to begin with. You're like, oh, I charged a pizza in college. Well, now the pizza has cost you like $2,000 in interest, right? You're making that kind of mistakes in software all the time. All of us are. So, here's an example. I was working for a startup, because that's my particular bent, that was pushing super, super hard to get their product ready for a big trade show, and we wanted to demo it, and we were stripping out everything that was not minimum viable product, right? Taking out all sorts of stuff that was half built because it was sort of buggy. We pulled it all out, and I was helping them do it, and there was beautiful documentation, and we made the deadline, and we made the trade show, and we got a proof of concept contract in Brazil. I don't know if you've ever sold software to Brazil, but they are persnickety about the language that they want it in, and that language is not English. So one of the things that we'd done when we were on this giant brush was to pull out our half-formed attempt to do referenced labels for our user interface and just hand-coded in the English, right? It's right there, it's easy, you it's the language you know. Well, then we had to go in and dig out all of the English. And we didn't have time to fix it properly with reference labels then either. So it took us, So we had to go dig it out, and it was terrible. And it took us 5 days to fix it by substituting hard-coded Portuguese for hard-coded English. And it took 2 weeks of developer time to go back and do it right because we had hundreds of pages as opposed to when we had started doing it when we had, 12 pages and building the design would have been easy. That was an anti-pattern that I noticed, and I was like, that was really expensive. Could we not do that again? And they're like, oh, well, it'll never happen again. And I'm like, other companies are going to do it again. So here's the thing. When you make a kludge like that, you promise yourself, super extra Scouts Honor promise. Wait, that's not Scouts Honor. Super extra promise yourself that you're going to go back and fix it as soon as you get a minute, right? You're going to go back and fix it. You don't want to leave it kludgy. Nobody wants to leave like wires dangling all over the place when they wire up AV. But here's the secret. You cannot fix it. Because as soon as you get time to breathe, you have customers. And the customers have been through your beta, which was a little rough, and they're here for you now, and they are unwilling for you to change that interface. They have adapted to that interface. They have grown around it like a tree around a fence. And if you move their cheese, they're going to be super angry. So you can't fix it because the only people who really matter are the customers, and the customers are telling you, don't touch it. I say that adding these things after you go to market is like trying to poke chocolate chip into a chocolate chip cookie that's already baked. My daughter helped me bake these cookies. It turns out there's no stock art of unbaked chocolate chip sitting on a cookie for some reason. I should remember to license it. But you're just going to mash the chocolate chip into the cookie and the chocolate chip suffer, and they're not the integrated and beautiful whole that they could be. So if you wait until you get a working prototype to do the right thing, this is your future. I told you I was going to tell you your future. This is your future, your grim, chocolate chippy future. So here's your money slide. It tells you where we're going to go. The 7 righteous fights, which I can never remember when I talk to people about this talk. I only ever get 5. It's a different 5 every time. But they are localization, security, extensibility, documentation, affordance, acceptance, and accessibility. And probably you're like, I know most of those, but at least one of those is weird. We'll get there. Localization. I last gave this talk in England, and I had these switched around, and they thought it was hilarious. It's less funny to us because the world caters to American English. But that slight discomfort you feel when you're using something that has the wrong SZ in it, that little weirdness you feel where software is not exactly meant for you, imagine how much that's magnified when it's not in your language at all. When you're like, oh, not only do I get to try and learn this software, I get to learn it in my 2nd, 3rd, 5th language. Super. I love computers and Americans. That's great. So you're going to need to localize. And maybe not this release, and maybe not next release, but soon, and you'd better plan for it because it takes forever. If you hire a localization consultant at the beginning of your project for just a couple days, it's a relatively minor expense, and say, will you tell us what we need to build hooks for so that in the future it will suck less to hire you again? They'll tell you, and they'll be like, oh, thank you for asking, because otherwise, like, I'm doing all of this tedious, like the translator equivalent of hand coding HTML. They don't want to do that. They'd like it if you built the hooks in. So ask them what you wish people would think of in advance. Here are the things that I know of from my experience on many painful localization projects. Don't hard code your interface elements. Use a reference list. The beauty of this is both that you can recreate the list in lots of languages and just spit it back out to the interface, and also you get a lot of value for your reuse. Because once you've translated the Word file, you've translated the word file, and all the places you reference it are magically and automatically updated, hopefully, if you did it right. Don't put any words besides your company name in your logo or your images. Screen caps are the worst. Like, as a technical writer, screen caps are my enemy, my sworn enemy, and I will dance in its blood eventually. But every time you put a word in a picture, when you go to localize it, you have to hire the really expensive translator who also does graphics. And by the way, German words are longer than English words, and Chinese words go the other direction. So every time you put a word in a picture, you're costing yourself literally hundreds of dollars if you're going to fully localize. It's crippling. It's just amazing. Bake in extended character support. Like, just go ahead and do that right now. And the reason I think this is super important is I think people need to be able to use their names. I think if your name is written in Hmong, you should be able to use your name. I think if your name has emoji in it, you should be able to use your name. And when I say people's names, I don't mean like their legal names. I mean their personal names, how they identify themselves. And if somebody is actually known as Top Hat Emoji Pipe Guy, that's his name. Why argue with him? Just support it. I had a friend named Noreen Plunkett who died about a year ago this time. And they had the worst time because they had a Gaelic name. There were a couple diacriticals over the I's. And every time they went to a technology conference, the badge maker would screw up. And so they would have to go around this technology conference with some kind of ASCII barf on their badge, feeling like they were not appropriate for the conference because nobody had stopped to consider getting their name right. I think it's a fundamental human right to have people call you the right thing. And I think that if your software is like, names 2 characters long aren't real names, you are denying people the right to be who they are, and you're making them angry at your software, like already. Like, log in, what's your name? Ha. Oh, that's not a legal name? That's funny, my mom told me it was. All right, security, are you braced? This is a long one because this could really be a book. And I would like to say if there are any secret, like, any secret hackers here, I'm sorry. It turns out the internet is not actually a series of tubes connected by badmen in hoodies, much to my surprise, because that's what the clip art has been telling me. The most successful looking penetration test ever is going to be performed by a middle-aged woman who looks like some kind of PricewaterhouseCoopers analyst. And she's just going to come in and say, show me your audit results, and everybody will just be like, have the thing. But the thing is, at this stage in your development, you don't care that much about security because unless you're a tiny little Bitcoin company, nobody cares about hacking you. But there will come a point when your Waffle Buddies app gets hacked and everyone's syrup preferences get dumped to paste bin. And then you have to stop all of production and all of everything and take this terrible PR hit and fix it right now because the world is on fire. And also, I cannot believe that you use Blueberry. That is so gross. So if you don't build in a little security now, you're going to end up here. Security is neither cheap nor easy, but it's better than the alternative. It's probably the place where it's easiest to over-optimize on these fights because it's expensive and it's hard to do well and you will never be perfect at it. But I think you can be more secure than the next person. When you're building something, please leave room for encryption. Just build in SSL right off the top of your head. Just put in HTTPS support right away. Don't cheat because it's going to be a pain to set up proxy servers or whatever it is you're thinking. Just put in room for encryption right now, and then you'll never have to think about it again. It'll just be there. Kill your data. I'm giving a whole talk on this fall because I feel so passionately about this. Here's what happened to me. 3 years ago, I moved back to Minneapolis from Seattle. I spent 5 years in Seattle. 2 years before I left Minneapolis, I applied for a job. Last year, I applied for a job at the same company because Minneapolis is, in many ways, not a huge town. I applied for a job. They're like, oh, hey, we remember you. I'm like, you what? Yeah, we remember you. We kept your job application containing all of your previous employer history and your salary information and your address. And I'm like, you kept that all? You didn't get rid of it? They're like, why would we get rid of it? It's valuable data. I'm like, it's not valuable data. I've had 4 addresses since then, except it's vulnerable data. I don't want anybody knowing what my salary was. I don't want anybody looking up my old employers. It's a huge threat surface. Why didn't you get rid of it? And they're like, storage is cheap. Storage is cheap. It's true. It's true. Amazon Glacier is the cryogenics of the cloud. But I want you to think about when you're creating a user, every time I want you to think about how you're actually going to delete them. Actually delete, not flip a bit and make it so they can't log in. Actually delete. Because otherwise, you're the US government and you have this enormous database of everybody's salary and job history and location and social security numbers, and it's just this giant threat surface. It's like a giant gummy worm just waiting to be eaten by the next opportunistic bird. So think about how long you're going to keep data before you start collecting it. Do you actually need all of the data you're collecting, or are you running on some automatic form generator? Like, do you need a salutation? I don't think so. The other problem with keeping data is that we grow and change. My spouse is currently in gender transition, and I have found out that you can change your driver's license, and you can change your birth certificate, and you can change your body, and you can change your medical records, but you cannot change your Spotify account. Like, there is no way to retain your data with a different name. That's not a thing that ever occurred to them. I'm like, that is 100% dudes making that choice because I've changed my name. And it's so hurtful to say you never get to change who you are. You have to like burn to the ground who you were instead of like incrementing it. Let's not be those people. I don't want to be that people. Don't roll your own auth. I saw somebody wearing a t-shirt from, I think it was Stormfront, and I really want it and they don't have it this year. But it said, friends don't let friends roll their own auth. There's a really good industry solution for authorization and authentication. There are several. You could use Active Directory, you could use SAML, you could use OpenID, but don't make your own for the love of God, because you know what happens? This picture, lovely Renaissance painting of Jesus, was a little damaged, church in Spain, and a parishioner was super upset about it. She's like, I just need to fix it. I can do this. I can do it myself. Monkey Jesus. If you roll your own auth, you will be making the authentication authorization version of Monkey Jesus. Like, let somebody else handle that. They've already done all of the painful parts. Don't do it yourself. Stop saying that word. The word might be Humperdinck, but is not in this case. That word is secure. So I used to work for MSRC, Microsoft Security Research Center, and I used to write the bulletins, which is just as thrilling as you think it is. If you think reading them is bad, just imagine writing them, because they're very tedious. But one of the things that the lawyers would come down and give us lectures on was how we could never say that we were secure, because that was an implied guarantee. You could be more secure, you could be security, but you cannot say secure. So I want you to imagine a pack of rabid lawyers like waiting outside your door for the next time you say, yes, we're secure. I actually fired a client for this because they were doing authentication and authorization and internal encryption. And if you have a CISSP, you know there's 6 more axes of security that they were not doing and were unwilling to even consider it. I'm like, then you're not secure. Stop saying it. So extensibility. This is the one where people give me the look. They're like, what do you mean extensibility? And this used to say APIs, because that's really what it is. Like, how do people plug into your product? How do they make it work for them in their way? But it occurred to me there's lots of hooks that aren't APIs. There's lots of ways to manipulate programs and get it to do what we want that aren't technically speaking APIs. So I wanted it to be something more generic. But whatever it is an interface between your goodness and the outside world. And I know that we all love to believe that our user interface is superior, but I also know from bitter experience that a lot of people will come along and say, I don't want any of that. We're going to build our own. Just give me the data. And if you have created an API that looks like this, it's embarrassing. It's sort of like the equivalent of the pastor comes over and your underwear's on the floor. Because you have names that are from The Simpsons on your APIs. You have possibly like bad words in your APIs. They're poorly constructed. They're like cross-wired, because you're only using them internally and everybody knows how to make it work. But it turns out that if you're selling somebody software, you don't actually want to call it Lisa Rulesors. I mean, Lisa does rule, but yeah. So when I left the company that I lost this argument to, they were writing their entire API structure over again because the naming was so bad that nobody actually knew how it worked. Documentation. I'm a technical writer. You knew I'd get here because I care deeply about documentation and have for years. Documentation is not state secrets. I have this argument all the time with product managers. I don't know what it is about product managers. They're really intense about putting it behind a firewall so they can gather metrics on who's looking at the documentation. They're like, we could get some great email addresses out of that. And I'm like, you could, but you have just said to somebody, I would rather you had to read spam than you just came and read my documentation. Freely accessible documentation is advertising. And I know a lot of people are like, those are my secrets. And I'm like, no, that's your interface. Like, your secrets are still back behind the wall. We'll put the curtain up in front and the wizard can keep on talking. But those aren't your secrets. That's your selling point. And a lot of sysadmins do not love getting phone calls because they can't make any decisions. And they would rather just read the documents and find out if it's going to work to do what they need to do to get their job done. So if you put it out there in the open, you make it friendly and accessible, they're going to like it a lot better than anything that you put behind a login, IBM. So, user documentation is what I do for a living. User documents are actually easy to retrofit. I can come in and create you a miracle in about a month for most reasonable sized software. That's fine, that's easy. I mean, not for you, but for me. I can create a whole structure and sustain it and everything, it's great. What's not easy? Imagine you have a tax that takes 10 weeks or 10 hours a month out of your developer's day. Like, you just lose him for a day and a half, gone. I'm here to tell you that you do, because as soon as you start growing, you start onboarding new developers, right? And if you don't have onboarding documentation, your senior developer has to sit next to your junior developer and answer stupid questions. And it's not the junior developer's fault. They don't want to be asking stupid questions, but they, honest to God, don't know where the repository is. Like, how would they know? So if you are not writing some kind of onboarding documentation to get your developers going, you are taxing your existing developers and pushing them closer to burnout, because it doesn't feel productive to mentor somebody on something boring. So if you write these documents, they can read them, they can update them for the new version, because every time you do this, you've changed the build slightly, like the process, and they're like, it doesn't work that way anymore. And you're like, oh, I guess you get to update the documentation. Just build that in. Like, hi, new girl, you get to write the documentation. Here's the 90% correct version. Then at least you have mostly current documentation, and the questions they ask the senior developers are not so bad. They're like interesting questions. production scripts and build sequence. No one ever gets technical writers to write this because it's in a wiki somewhere. I gave a lightning talk on this called Fear of the Bus, because sometimes it isn't even in a wiki somewhere. Sometimes it's in someone's head, or like a quarter in the wiki and 3/4 in their head. People don't write this down, and then it is disastrous when you lose that one person, when they get fired or hit by a bus or a better job offer, and they leave and you can't build or ship or whatever it is that you need to do, because it didn't occur to anyone that that was like secret knowledge. So when you hire a build engineer, the first thing I want you to ask them for is documentation samples. If they cannot prove they have been able to communicate what they're doing to someone outside of themselves, don't hire them, because secretive build engineers are bad build engineers. They are hoarding data and knowledge. They like being the only people who can fix things in an emergency, and they are a weak point, a bottleneck. So don't do it. Don't keep somebody secretive and cagey in this position. So, release notes. Everybody loves release notes, right? Nobody loves release notes. I hate release notes with a fiery, burning passion. I'm so tired of writing release notes. I've been writing release notes for 20 years. It turns out that if sysadmins and installers and the actual people who get your software going read anything, it's the release notes, because they want to know what you're going to break or what you're going to fix. But mostly they're kind of cynical and they're like, what's this going to break? So because they are the point person for getting your software to operate and update, maybe we should give them a little more love and a little more formatting than dumping this into a GitHub README, which I see so often, and I'm like, just a little bit more love. Like, you could send it as an email and a GitHub. Like, that would be okay. So think a little bit about who it is that's reading your documentation and what documentation is actually valuable to them. Affordance. This is the other one where people are kind of confused. Affordance is doing what the interface makes easy and obvious. Affordances tell us all sorts of things about the tiny interactions we have with the world and with software. Most people talk about the affordance of hardware, which is the way your USB plug goes in. But software also offers its affordances with a big yes button in green and a tiny gray more information button. We think you want to click yes more than you want to read documentation. This picture is where I used to go to work every day. This is the worst crosswalk in the world. This is the sidewalk. This is the crosswalk, and this is the crosswalk button. This is where you have to stand in order to push the crosswalk button. This is relevant because I live in Minneapolis, where we literally measure snow in feet. So guess what happens when it snows? We get this plowed. It's a bike trail. It's very nice. We get this plowed. Accessibility. There's the curb cut. No, there is no curb cut there. That's right. No curb cut at the end of the sidewalk. Curb cut's over here. And knee-high to hip-high pile of snow in front of the button that you have to push to cross the busy street. This is terrible affordance. It's confused, but haven't we all used software like that, where it's like, I don't know what you want me to do, nothing is lining up? Have you ever had that moment with Angular? I don't know, maybe it's just me, could be me, but if we're not thinking about how people are actually trying to cross the street in our software, as opposed to where things ought to go, like there should be this much setback from the curb for the sidewalk, then we're screwing up. Some people have more privilege than others. This lady obviously has a lot, and also has a fancy dress that I really envy. When we develop software, we pretty much always develop it as an admin or a super user, right? And when you log into your test system, what's your test word? Like, what's your test user? Does it say admin? Mine does. On at least 3 systems I've used. It's like admin and then like variation of the company name for a password. Because you want to log into the administrator console where all of the features are so you can look at them, right? It turns out that that's an edge case. Admin is an edge case. And the common use case is much more important, but we don't test it because we have a lot of privilege. We're developers. So here's a thought experiment, or an actual experiment. Log in to your test system as a user, not a super user, just a user, and try to do a thing. Is that how you want to live your life every day? Do you want to do that 20 times a day? Because that's frequently what we're asking our users to do, is this more complicated, less streamlined flow that we haven't optimized because we're not suffering from it. This is a homunculus, which I think is a great concept. It looks weird and distorted because it is mapped based on nerve sensation rather than the physical appearance of the body. So the hands are super big because we have a lot of nerves in our hands. When we are developers, we kind of go on a physical model of the body theory. Like, we have an architecture that we're thinking about. We're like, oh, there's a login, and there's some data entry, and a log out, and these are all the same weight to us. But when you're a user, you're getting a really different image. You're getting a homunculus, because there are things you do a lot more often than you do click the admin panel, or whatever thing that you think is an equal weight to enter data. I had this fight with a healthcare company I worked for. They made a scraper that scraped Medicare data off the top and put it into a less heinous green, like the Medicare data is coming in on a green screen, right? It could be from the 80s. It is from the 80s, really. It is hard. It's horrifying. But they scraped it all. They made it nice. They made it pretty. They made it mouseable. They had not watched any of the people who used the software, and what happened was they got a lot of terrible responses, and they couldn't figure it out. They're like, we made it so much better. You don't have to tab through 15 screens. Well, if you tab through 15 screens every patient, 90 patients a day, it's not that bad. You never touch your mouse. You practically have it in muscle memory. But it had never occurred to them, because that's not how they use the system, that they had caused a problem. So speaking of users, acceptance. Have you shown this to any actual humans who are like the users? This is not the same as the people who will pay you money for the product. It is not the same as the people who show up at trade shows. It is the people who sit in fire trucks and nurses' stations and other sometimes uncomfortable places, sometimes, cubicle farms, whatever it is. It's so easy for us to think of the user as the same as the purchaser. But they're really at a different level. They're divorced. They're trying to make business decisions as opposed to daily usage decisions. So find some people who actually use your software. They could look like the village people. That would be awesome. Sit them down in front of your software and ask them to do their work. Explain nothing. Don't tell them how it's supposed to work. Don't say, hey, this is a thing that you could click. Just watch them and shut up. Shut up. It's so hard to do. I think this is why companies that can afford it have the two-way mirrors and the microphones and everything like that. It reminds you that you're not supposed to help them. If you have a good idea of what they do in their daily work, you can give them a script so that you get a consistent set of results. But if you don't know, just watch them use the software, take notes, don't say anything, and give them a present. Because it's hard work coming in and unlearning things that you already know how to do. So I really believe everybody should hire a usability expert. And I am also a realist. You should hire a usability expert, absolutely. You're not going to, because you're not going to be able to find the money for that. You might find a front-end person. You might find a user interface person. User experience is different than both of those. So you're going to have to become your own UX student. There's a lot of really interesting books and talks out there. The keyword you're looking for is guerrilla UX. And there's a lot of things on how to stop the man on the street and get them to do UX. And the one book that I think you should start with that's just going to blow your mind is Kathy Sierra's Badass, Making Users Awesome. It is the summation of everything that she's learned, both about users and software, and about training horses, which seems really unrelated, but is in fact super related to how we learn software and how we feel about learning software and how we feel about using things. So you should totally read it, and you should buy it in paper because it's got some weird formatting stuff, because it's Kathy Sierra. Accessibility. We all use computers in different ways. Does your software allow for that? Here are some ways you can do accessibility with relatively little effort and pretty much no money. Do you wear glasses? Take off your glasses and look at your screen. How's that look? Looks pretty terrible, huh? Remember that not everybody can afford to get their vision corrected properly. If you don't wear glasses, borrow your coworkers carefully and put them on. Again, it's surprising how much detail you can lose with a very little drop in visual acuity. I'm telling you that presbyopia, which is the way your eyes change as you get older, is coming for you all. I can tell because it came for me last year. I was shocked and horrified. I'm like, what is happening to me? It's just a thing that happens, and it's not like we're going to get any younger. So you're probably going to want to use some kind of visual aid as you get older. Consider that. Have you looked at it on a screen that is not a retina screen? This is the worst. This is the worst because I can tell who buys their UI developers giant retina screens like this big. You're like, you could just take a nap on that thing, because all of the buttons are tiny and all of the color distinctions are small, and it looks beautiful. It looks beautiful on a retina screen. Do you know what it looks like on a phone? Do you know what it looks like on a 2-year-old phone? Not even like an old phone, like a 2-year-old phone, right? It looks terrible. But because we, again, are living in the land of privilege, we look at it on a Macintosh and we look at it on a big screen, and we're like, oh, the CSS takes care of that reflow. Oh, it's a responsive site. It's all good. Have you actually looked at the responsive site? Because, bless their hearts, they're trying to make it better, but you can't tell until you look whether or not it's actually worked. 8%. Does anybody know what the statistic is? Nope. 8% of men are red-green colorblind. Strangely, these men never become UX designers. It's like they're not funneled into that somehow. Every time you design a stop-go feature or a uptime feature that involves red is okay, or red is a problem, green is fine, remember that 8% of the world cannot tell the difference. The little circles are kind of a muddy brown, depending on how it's expressed. They're not distinguishing information. So there's a bunch of really cool websites that allow you to see your site as it looks to somebody with different forms of colorblindness. I have a web post that is all of these items up. You can go to HeidiWaterhouse.com, and I put in links to a couple of these tests. But remember, 8% is a huge number. Like, by the odds, 3 or 4 of you in this room are at least some kind of red-green colorblind. And that's not even counting the people who are like yellow-blue colorblind. It's almost always men. It's an XY thing. So, there are people who use screen readers, and there are people who use descriptive links. And the screen reader people only love the people who use the descriptive links, because if you don't use descriptive links, if you're using an automatic generator, if you're lazy about how you write this down, this is what your screen looks like. There's nothing to tell you anything about where you're at. There's nothing. And if you use a descriptive link, people are slightly more reassured about clicking on it because they know where they're going. Like, click here for information about this. It's really easy. It takes 30 seconds. And when the ADA hits you, because you haven't done this, you will regret your life. And I'm here to tell you, the Americans with Disabilities Act applies to software that is purchased with federal money. It's not deeply enforced yet, but they are saying that they are going to start working on that more. 18F has a lot of resources on how to get better at this. 18F, awesome organization. But if you are getting paid by any kind of federal money, if you are selling to a college or to a hospital, odds are you are actually under ADA and you're probably not compliant. It doesn't take a ton to be compliant. They're revising the rules, but you should probably go look them up. The other thing you should do is hide your mouse. Unplug it, stick it in a drawer for a week. How much do you hate your life right now? A lot of people have repetitive motion injury. I had repetitive motion injury. I had to go on disability for a while. Anybody else? Carpal tunnel, shoulder freeze up, yeah. If your site is unusable by tabbing, you're making it unusable to a larger chunk of people than you think. And I find it amazing which sites are unusable by tabbing, like Gmail. Don't even try it. It's just crying all the way down, because it takes you off into the far links, and you can't get back out of them for like 40 clicks because there are so many links on the page. So if you spend a week without your mouse, you're going to have a lot more sympathy for how people who cannot use a mouse are feeling. It's not a real tech talk without a cat picture, right? It turns out not everybody has high-speed internet all the time. And not everybody has employer supplements on their cell phone data. And it's really rude to start playing a video at somebody if they are actually paying for their data. But we all know that, like autoplay videos. We've already discussed that, and we're kind of over them, except we're not because we're putting them in ads. But there are a lot of other people who have sort of marginal internet. Like my parents live in this weird Shangri-La that involves not having cell signal. Like it's a tiny volcanic valley and there's no cell signal. Just, there's only 300 people. It's not worth putting a tower in. And their internet is terrible. And this matters because if you look at it, we are putting huge pages in. The guy who does Pinboard, whose name I've forgotten right now, said, if your web page is bigger than a classic of Russian literature, you're probably doing it wrong. And I love that as a test. Like, is your single web page more data than War and Peace? It often is. It really heartbreakingly often is bigger than War and Peace. And we're not thinking about that, or if we're thinking about it, we're thinking about it like, oh, in Bangladesh and India and Africa, they don't have broadband. Well, no, we don't have broadband a lot of time here, 10 miles from the city. So I worked on the Microsoft server team for a while, and I fought and lost a righteous fight there, and it rankles me. Like, I should not have lost this one. It's one of the ones that was hard. I was working on the server team on Longhorn, which tells you how long ago this was. And we had this exciting new concept where we would put up a skeleton help file, and then we would let you download current help as you needed it. Like just-in-time documentation. What a great idea, right? Do you know who does not like their servers touching the internet? People who put them in nice, clean, safe server rooms with ferocious firewalls to keep them from touching the internet. Letting your server touch the internet is like letting it lick a dirty toilet. You just don't do it. But you can't get to the help if you don't touch the internet. So they'd go back to their desk and they'd sit down at their computer and they'd try and download the help. And they couldn't because it wasn't a server machine. I lost that fight, and we had a lot of really angry users because there was effectively no server documentation. A+ job, team. Let's not be that team. Let's not say you must have internet in order for this to work. We are all only temporarily able-bodied. Eventually, we're all going to pass into the realm of age, illness, disease, injury. Some of the people in the room next to you already have, and they hate the gray-on-gray buttons with the gray text and the bottomless scroll that makes it impossible to get to the tab navigation at the bottom. But we're all headed there. We're all temporarily able-bodied. And even if you don't think other people are worth fighting for in this arena, in the usability, accessibility arena, aren't you worth fighting for? Isn't future you worth that? So now what? That was super grim. I told you all the things you're doing wrong. I'm sorry. But I have some good ideas. I've given you some strategy, the big goals for making your products more usable, extensible, beautiful, usable, well-designed. Here are some tactics. Start where you are. Use what you have. Do what you can. It's an Arthur Ashe quote, and I really love it because it's very much about incremental, agile improvement. You don't have to fix the world, but you have to start where you are and do what you can about it. So, tactic 1, write a coding style guide and follow it. I'm not talking like some kind of massive sun-sized book. I'm saying agree on a naming standard. Please, agree on a naming standard for how you name things and make everyone stick to it because it just makes it so much easier for the next person. Here at Pivotal, we've been talking about pair programming all week. I guess this is a thing that people do voluntarily. I'm a writer. I'm like feral and antisocial. Use pair programming to encourage each other to use these best practices. Once you have a style guide, it's much easier to keep it up if somebody remembers like one thing and reminds you when you pair with them, and you remember for them whatever it is that they have trouble keeping in their head. Host brown bag lunches. This is a totally almost free or free solution for team bonding that doesn't involve any travel. What you do is you get everybody together in a conference room, you block the time off, say 2 hours, you order a pizza or you have people bring their lunch, and you watch a technical talk, and then you talk about it. It's like a book club, but less like time constraint and pressure. And there's a ton of great recorded talks in the world. You could watch talks from this conference. You could go back and say, hey, I saw this great talk by this woman with pink hair. It was amazing. Whatever it is that your team is interested in, go learn about it together so that you have something to talk about other than the project you're on, the conflicts you're having, and your fantasy football league. Ask questions. I think a lot of you have heard the 5 whys theory. Like, keep drilling down and asking why you're doing something until you understand what the goal is. But I think we all need to remember to do that. This is why I'm adding as a tactic, like, why are we trying to do that? Not just because we always have, not because it's industry standard, not even because it's best practice. What does it get us? How does that benefit us? Add tests for accessibility and usability. Just bake those into your test suite. Say, hey, have you run the color blindness test yet? No? Okay, well, go run it. Oh, it doesn't pass? This one's a really hard request. Learn to write ROI documents. Return on investment is kind of what floats the boats of the people with the money. If you can say, I think we need to incorporate better colorblindness testing because 8% of men, which is 16% of our demographic, can't tell red from green, and we are losing this much to our competitors because of it. That's a much more compelling argument than we should do this because it's the right thing. So there's a lot of good examples on the internet. I'll see if I can get some up myself. It doesn't have to be like this huge, elaborate, like multi-page essay. It's just like, here's what we're doing, here's how much it's costing us, here's how much it would cost to change it, and here's the benefit. That's all there is to it. Cultivate inclusion, diversity, and representation. And you're all thinking about your teams, but think about also your clients. The more diverse and inclusive and accepting you make your client base, the easier it is to recruit team members from it, and the easier it is to sell to more people in the world. Like, if you are the software that makes it easy to get around by tabbing, you've suddenly opened up this whole market that you didn't know existed. So consider how much you're going to make by being easier to use. Money is the root of all business decisions. You're not going to convince somebody they should do this because it's the right thing. Companies don't ever change their behavior because they want to be more ethical, inclusive, or even efficient. They change because it makes financial sense. If there's one thing I've learned about fighting the righteous fight, it's that money is the ridiculously effective argument. So if it won't cost much and it will save a lot of money, your odds of getting it done are pretty good. So, what do the righteous fights help with? Mostly making users' lives better, but also making building and maintaining the product significantly cheaper for the long run. Even if you're not there to see it, somebody is thanking past you for putting those hooks in. So, that was too long and you read Twitter instead of listening to me. I understand, I do that too sometimes. Don't build in compounding technical debt that you could trivially avoid. There's some that you can't avoid, and there's some that you will break your heart trying to get out of. But if you can trivially avoid it, if you can easily bypass some compounding technical debt, do it and look like a rock star in 6 months or a year. Be productively lazy. To be productively lazy is to invest a tiny bit of effort now so that you can reap much larger rewards later. I think about this all the time because I'm trying to teach my children to wash dishes. It is infinitely easier for me to wash dishes than to teach them to do it because they're really bad at it and I have to keep going back and making them do it. But when I get this honed, when I get this down, I don't have to wash dishes anymore. That's a child chore. I have invested a little bit up front and have been productively lazy, and for the next 10 years or so, somebody else is doing the dishes. So think about how you can do a little upfront investment and be productively lazy so that you can glide through life a little easier later on. I'm really happy I got to talk to you. This was a lot of fun, and I am really glad that I got to give the full length of this talk. I appreciate your attention, and if you have any questions, I would be happy to take them. Also, you can find me later at the conference. I'm easy to spot. Yeah?
All right, so for one piece team, which is already doing a job development and heavily is invested in their program, they have a weekly iterations and I guess some velocity and some releases that they have to meet.
Mm-hmm.
How would you encourage that team to adopt the principle, the practices of documentation?
Okay, so the question is, for one pizza team that has deadlines that they already have to hit and they're working pretty hard already, they're already pretty close to maxed, how do you encourage them to write documentation? I think what you do is you make it rewarding to have written documentation. You're like, the thing is, people do not respond well to punishment or even the fear of punishment, but we respond really well to reward. And what you need to say is like, I know it's a slight pain to write a little bit more, but if we, going forward, I'm not going to make you go back and do anything, but like going forward, if we could do 10 minutes right after our sprint when we're all already disrupted on what our commits were, that would be, 60 minutes of documentation in a day. And it wouldn't feel huge to any one person, but it would be like, yay, you get a gold star, you did your documentation for the day. And have a little lottery that says, if you get, it's a lot like incentivizing children, I'm sorry, but if you get 10 stars, then you get to pick the pizza flavor or whatever it is. In St. Paul, they have a pizza flavor that involves sauerkraut. I'm not even kidding. I know, sauerkraut and sausage. It's very popular. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it would be difficult than just developers.
So what do the developers find rewarding?
Well, from a developer's perspective, what I find rewarding is delivering the features that I have been working on throughout the week.
Right.
Trying to make sure I have a good test suite that goes good. So for me, as long as I can deliver that feature to production at the end of the iteration, that will make me happy.
Okay, so a developer finds it rewarding to deliver something that they've been working on at the end of the week and be able to say, look, this is done, this is finished. You can make documentation one of your tests, where it's required, which you'll get a little pushback on that one. Or you can make documentation, like putting in a little release note blurb, the reward, this is how you know I did it. It's not just I checked off this JIRA box, but like, here's a paragraph on what I did. And even that much documentation is going to make a huge amount of difference in trying to collect it together for release notes. Because it's really easy when you're solving a bug to write out the symptoms, the cause, the solution, but at no point does anyone go down into the actual cause. They go with the trigger. And so if you could just convince people to write down like why it failed that way, then they would have that like I finished a thing reward. All right, have fun.